and welcome to another installment of our Farm Transition Workbook video series. In this video, we're going to talk about family communications and meetings. These are some very important pieces that we've got as part of our overall farm transition process. Today we're going to talk about improving family communications and the value that that has not just for the farm transition planning process, but the value that it has for strengthening your family as well. We're also going to talk about understanding the perspective of other stakeholders and trying to walk a mile in their shoes, so to speak, so that we can get better input from them and also have more buy-in from everyone involved as we move forward with the transition planning process. Last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about conducting family meetings. In other words, how do we engage ourselves in the actual face-to-face discussions that are going to form the foundation for our farm transition plan going forward. Communications is often cited by lots of people engaged in the transition process as one of the most difficult pieces of the whole process itself. Why don't we communicate so well as families? Well, first off, we often don't understand the perspectives that other people might bring to the table, and that's just human nature. We understand our own context that we bring to discussions about the family farm, but we may not have had the experiences, the upbringing, the same values that others do, and as a result, we just have different perspectives. And sometimes we need to take a step back to understand those perspectives first, and that's difficult for us to do, especially in the heat of a potentially difficult conversation. We may have also had negative experiences when it came to talking about the family business in the past. Lots of times, if people don't want to engage in difficult conversations, they'll simply withdraw, or they might exercise their fight or flight instincts and instead choose to be very aggressive in those discussions. And so we kind of just have taught ourselves one way or another to shy away from having those discussions at all. If we're talking about the founding member of a family business, they may have a real fear of losing control. They've worked hard to accumulate these business assets, and they feel like they rightly have the power and authority to say what's going to happen in the future of the family farm. And they're worried that by soliciting input, they're ceding some of that control without getting anything in return. They might also be really reluctant to change. And again, this is a pretty human condition. We're all somewhat afraid of change to some extent, and oftentimes we don't want to change unless the pain of staying the same is less than the pain of changing. And so then we're actually motivated to change. But absent that, though, we really tend to stay in our little ruts and kind of go with the flow. So communication is necessary to beget change, and sometimes we just think that we can avoid change if we don't communicate. And then there's always the fear of the answer that we might get. If we're asking a child if they want to come back and have a role on the family farm, what if they say no? Or what if someone that we would prefer not to have involved in the day-to-day operations say yes, they would like that kind of role? So these are all things that we have concerns about, and these are just natural barriers that we have to communicating with our family members, especially in the context of our family transition plan. We can improve these things, though. We can take the bull by the horn and actually do some things proactively to improve our communication skills. One of the cures for not understanding the perspective of others is to really devote some study to trying to understand that perspective. And one way we can do this that might actually be a little bit fun and actually serve a bit of a team building role for our family is to try to understand the personality types of our family. We can do personality assessments to figure out not only the personality types of others involved in our family, but we can do a personality type assessment on ourselves and kind of understand why we view the world the way that we do. We can also work to improve our communication skills and understand just a little bit of communication theory. I'm not saying that you have to go out and make yourself a family communications expert, but I think everyone could benefit from a little bit more understanding of just how communications between family members work. Again, this will have benefit not just for our family business discussions, but for our family as a whole. We can understand a little bit about nonverbal communication and understand that how we say things may be every bit as much important as what we say. We can also work on developing our active listening skills. In other words, not just hearing what the other person is saying, but really trying to derive the meaning that they're trying to convey to us. Lots of times I think we overlook the importance of nonverbal communication. And communication research shows that what you say is probably not as important as how you say it. If you look at the communication breakdown, most of the information that we convey when we're speaking with someone, 97% according to some studies, is in nonverbal cues. Our tone of voice, our body language, the way that we hold ourselves. Only 7% of the message are the actual words that we use. So when you start to realize this, you start to become much more conscious of how you say things, not just in terms of the words you use, and don't ever underestimate the importance of words. The selection of the words matters a lot, but the tone with which we say them, the body language that we use, the poise that we have, all of those are ways of communicating to our family members how we feel about the message that we're conveying and also the message that we're receiving. One way to improve our means of listening is something that's called active listening. You might also hear this called the speaker-listener technique. And there are kind of three basic sets of rules that we have here. First off, when we're talking about the speaker, number one, speak for yourself. In other words, you're not trying to guess what the other person engaged in the conversation is thinking. You're only going to talk about your perspectives and try to do so in a way that others can easily understand you. When we're talking, we're not going to ramble on and on and on. We're going to basically make our point and give the other person involved in the conversation the opportunity to absorb that information and then engage in active listening themselves. That's the next step right there. Stop and let the listener paraphrase. In other words, let that person hear what you've said, process it for a moment, and then repeat back to you what they think they heard. That gives you an opportunity for a secondary exchange there to say, yes, I think you understood what I was trying to say, or it gives you the opportunity to say, well, maybe I didn't convey my message effectively. Let's try that another way. It's an opportunity for that feedback loop to make sure that both the speaker and the listener are getting as close to the same message as possible. So when we're talking about the listener, whenever you've heard what the speaker's saying, again, paraphrase back what you hear. That gives you a chance to say, have I processed the information that you were relaying to me correctly? Also, when you're listening to the other person, don't be focusing on what you're going to say in response to them. Lots of times we make the mistake of hearing what someone's saying, and if we don't agree with it, we're automatically trying to come up with a rebuttal for that. Don't do that. Instead, focus on what they're saying, try to understand, and then you can talk about your response. Finally, when we're talking about both the speaker and the listener, remember that while someone's speaking, let them speak. Don't interrupt if it's at all possible. And while the person that is listening is paraphrasing, the speaker, in other words, still has the floor. In other words, they still have the ability to go on and clarify what they're saying to make sure that there's mutual understanding. And then make sure that you share the floor. In other words, don't let one person dominate the conversation entirely. This is a share and share-like process. So that's a little bit about active listening. Now let's talk about how we can engage our other stakeholders. In other words, when we're trying to pull other family members into the conversation, maybe when they're reluctant to do so, what are some things that we can do to help us understand their perspective and make them feel more connected to the conversation? First off, we can understand the generational differences, and we'll talk about some general traits that we tend to see with the generations here in just a few slides. But understanding that generations, in other words, by virtue of their age and their upbringing, tend to have certain perspectives can help us understand and address those perspectives. We can also talk about the different personality types involved, and again, it might be a fun exercise for your family to go through to do some personality assessments to see what personalities are in the room. This can also be done in the form of some team exercises and actually work on a little bit of family business team building that can be really valuable to you. If you're looking for some ideas about where you can go for some of those personality assessments, one of those is the Real Colors exercise. That can be found at www.realcolors.org. Another one is the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, available at www.myersbriggs.org. And then the Clifton-Gallup Strengths Finder exercise is one that's used frequently here on the OSU campus. That's available at www.strengthsfinder.com. Now let's talk about some of the different personality types that are based on generational traits. And remember, when we're talking about these generational traits, understand that we don't mean that everyone born within these years are going to have these specific traits. That's not what we're saying at all. But what we're saying is that research indicates that people born during these periods tend to have had similar cultural experiences, and as a result, those cultural experiences can lead to certain perspectives on communication and leadership, and it may be valuable for us to understand those perspectives as we're trying to engage members of those generations in conversations. The first generation that we're going to talk about are traditionalists, and traditionalists make up a pretty big chunk of farmland ownership in the United States these days, although a lot of that ownership is now starting to transition to the baby boomers. But traditionalists, or as they're sometimes called, the greatest generation, were born between 1920 and 1945, and their defining cultural events were the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and World War II. Pretty serious national emergencies. Now, their perspective on family tends to be very strongly focused on traditional family and extended family. In other words, family means not only mom, dad, and children, but mom, dad, children, grandma and grandpa, grandchildren, and the like. They value a very strong work ethic, and because of their cultural perspective, again, we're talking about the Depression and World War II, they have a tendency towards command and control. These were times of great crisis, and during times of great crisis, a very strict chain of command with little questioning of authority tends to get results. That's how we respond in emergencies. And so they tend to have a top-down view of leadership. In other words, those that are in charge make commands or policy decisions, and those commands are followed by the people down the line. And there may not be a lot of opportunity for consensus-driven leadership there. The next generation that we can talk about are the baby boomers, born between 1945 and 1964, and this is the largest generation that we've ever had in American history. Their defining events were the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the Civil Rights Movement. Their focus tends to be less on extended family and more on the nuclear family, mom and dad. Since this was one of the generations that started to become much more mobile, there may not have been the opportunity to maintain the connections with an extended family, and so the nuclear family became much more of a focus. They tend to question the integrity of leadership, again, generally a function of the cultural events that occurred during their youth, but they do value hard work and a strong sense of personal, professional success. Their leadership and communication style tends to be a little bit more participatory, a little bit more consensus-driven, and so that tends to sometimes conflict with the traditional generation's view of a command and control top-down structure. The next generation that we have, the Generation Xers, is actually the smallest generation that we've had generally in U.S. history. Gen Xers are born between 1964 and 1980. For example, I picked on myself when I put this picture in here. I'm a member of the Gen Xers myself. Our defining events were the introduction of a large amount of personal technology. You might call us digital immigrants in that technology may not have been our first language, but we learned it fairly quickly and early on in life. Lots of Gen Xers started out as latchkey kids, which made them be very independent. And while they probably tend to have more of a nuclear versus an extended view of family, they're also willing to include others that aren't actually biological relatives as part of families. In other words, very close friends might have the same standing as family to Generation Xers. Because of that latchkey heritage, Gen Xers tend to be very self-reliant, and then that feeds into their view of leadership and communication. They tend to be not committed to organizations, but instead more internally or individually focused, and have a little bit less respect for authority as a result of that. That then leads to the Millennials that were born from 1980 to the present, and if you look at their childhood, they had a number of very challenging cultural activities going on during their childhood, including Columbine, the Oklahoma City bombing, the advent of the internet, and even some of the youngest millennials would include 9/11 in that. Because we were shifting drastically as a culture from the kind of hands-off approach that we took with Gen Xers to a much more hands-on approach with millennials, nuclear family, again, is hugely important to millennials. Unrelated friends, though, are also very involved in their lives as well. Millennials have a very deep value on having meaning in their work. In other words, they want to know that what they do matters. From a leadership and communication standpoint, Millennials have grown up in an era where they have many more options for how they consume media content, how they engage in consumer decisions, and kind of as an outgrowth of that, they like to have options in how they go about approaching a problem. They're also very technologically adept and will use a variety of technologies to solve a problem. Sometimes, because they've had such strong parental involvement, they may have a fairly strong sense of entitlement as well, and sometimes that's a challenge in dealing with millennials. But they're also amazingly creative. They don't view the world as discrete chunks of disciplines. In other words, this is an engineering problem or this is a financial problem. But they view problems as being systems-based, and as a result can come up with incredibly creative solutions if you don't tell them how to solve a problem, if you just tell them what the problem is to be solved. An interesting thing about all of these generations is that generations always have the most difficult time dealing with the immediately adjacent generation. In other words, traditionalists have the hardest time dealing with boomers, but traditionalists can do pretty well with Gen Xers. Boomers have a hard time dealing with Xers, but boomers can deal pretty well with millennials. And then, of course, Xers and millennials have the hardest time dealing with each other because, quite honestly, culturally, they're probably the furthest apart, even though they actually share some commonalities, especially when it comes to dealing with technology. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive overview of all the generational traits, and we'll point you to some references later on that you can use to help understand some of these generational issues. But we just want to underscore the point that having a perspective on these generational traits can help you a lot as you're trying to engage stakeholders of these generations in your transition planning discussions. Now that we've talked about some of those stakeholder traits, let's talk about conducting family business meetings for a moment. So what is a family business meeting? When we talk about family business meetings in this context, what we're talking about are meetings where we're going to discuss some really important issues. So we're not talking about what we would call tactical meetings. A tactical meeting is a meeting that you might have very frequently, maybe at the first of each day or at the first of each week, where we discuss what's going to happen today or what's going to happen this week on the farm. Similarly, it's not an emergency meeting where all the family comes together to deal with a crisis. For example, if one of the founding generation becomes injured and has to be hospitalized, and we've got to make some decisions about how we're going to manage the farm in their absence. We'd call that more of an emergency meeting, really, rather than a family business meeting. So when we're talking about a family business meeting, what we are talking about is a meeting where we're going to discuss important long-term strategic issues. In other words, issues that are going to have a long-term bearing on the future of the farm. And clearly, talking about our farm transition plan is one of those family business meetings. And this is really, I think, often overlooked. Whenever we talk about having family business meetings, people go, oh no, it's one more meeting, and meetings are what bog down those guys that work in offices. We're a family farm, we're all about action and getting stuff done. Certainly, family farms have a lot to get done, but we can't overlook how important having a long-term strategic vision is to our success, not just as a business, but in really engaging in a successful transition planning process. And that's something that we've talked about in some other videos in this series as well. So as we talk about these family business meetings, what are some important things to watch out for? You know, we've all seen examples in the movies of how family get-togethers can sometimes go tragically and perhaps comically wrong. So when we're talking about our family meeting, how do we avoid that? How do we actually have a productive family meeting? One thing that we can do is make sure that we engage all of the stakeholders. So, as we've talked about at other points in this series, the stakeholders may include people that have a financial investment in the farm, people that have an emotional investment in the farm, for example, people that grew up there, and people that depend on the farm in one way or another, or that we depend on. People like employees, hired hands, very important vendors such as our lenders. Those are all stakeholders, and at some point in time we may need to engage all of them in the process. Some of these stakeholders may all need to be at one big important meeting. So we need to make sure that we engage the right parties. We're going to tell them, look, we're going to talk about the future of our family farm. That way there are no surprises. People don't get ambushed, so to speak, when they come to a family gathering just expecting to have a good time with the people that they love, and they say, aha, now we're going to talk about a really weighty issue. We're going to be very clear and transparent about what the point of our discussion is. We're not going to do this on a holiday. And why would we want to do this on a holiday? Well, we might want to do it on a holiday because that's when everyone's there, right? Everyone gets together for Christmas or everyone gets together for Thanksgiving. So it's convenient, theoretically. But the problem is that the holidays already carry a lot of emotional stress for lots of families, and talking about a very difficult topic like the future of the family farm may just add stress to the situation. It may lessen the enjoyment of what should otherwise be a joyous family event, and vice versa, the stress of the family event might make this discussion even more difficult than it already needs to be. So we're not going to have this discussion on a holiday. We're going to need to make it its own separate event. Part of the advantage of making it its own separate event, by the way, is that gives the event some gravity. By having a separate event apart from another time when the family's all going to be together, communicates to the family and all the stakeholders that this is something that's important. We're going to set time aside to do this. This matters. When we're talking about a location for the meeting, we're going to find a comfortable place, and we're talking about a place that's actually physically comfortable, because think about a time that you've had to sit through a meeting in a physically uncomfortable place. You became so distracted by the physical discomfort that you weren't really paying attention to the substantive content of the meeting itself. We're also going to have this at a place that is not someone's home. If you think about it for a second, let's say that you ignore this advice and you have the meeting at a holiday, okay? Where do we meet for the holidays? Well, typically mom and dad's house, right? And if we're going to have this meeting at mom and dad's house, what room of the house do you have important family meetings in? The dining room, of course. And where does everyone sit in the dining room? Where everyone always sat. And in that environment, mom and dad have the same amount of emotional authority that they had when you were a little kid. And so that's a very comfortable environment for mom and dad to have this discussion because they have all the power there. But remember, at least in these few initial family meetings that we're having, we're trying to get open, honest feedback from everyone so that we really understand their perspectives and how they feel about the future of the family farm and their role in the future of the family farm. To do that, we need to have a place that everyone feels very comfortable sharing in an open and honest way. So that means that this may need to be what we would call a neutral field game, so to speak. We might need to find a comfortable place that's not anyone's home so that everyone feels a little bit more on the same footing when they're having their discussions. We also need to make sure that this environment's free of distractions. So the cell phones go away, computers go away, we have an environment where we can just concentrate on what each other is saying. Additionally, we need to make sure that there's any distractions outside of the room taken care of. That means that for the day-to-day tasks on the farm, while we're having this meeting, we're going to make sure that we've got a hired hand or someone else in place to take care of that stuff so that no one has to excuse themselves from the discussion. They're there both physically and mentally and really engaged in the discussion process. And we're doing all this so we can really get good, honest input from all of the stakeholders about what we want to do about the future of the farm, and again, how people want to view themselves as being a part of that future. As we go throughout these family meetings, it's going to be important to have a facilitator, someone that's kind of responsible for making sure that the parties stick to the agenda and that the conversation keeps moving forward in a positive way. So as an initial facilitator, it's important to start with someone that everyone trusts that's going to be there. That may mean that we hire someone within the family for that role, so to speak, or it may mean that we have to find somebody outside of the family, someone that has no emotional stake at all in this process that everyone can trust. Later on, as the family becomes more comfortable communicating with each other, we might want to rotate that role amongst family members, and that rotation can let everyone again feel like they have a meaningful role in the process, and it kind of shares the burden. You also need to make sure that for each family meeting that there is a clear agenda. We're going to have very clear objectives so that everyone understands what we're there to do. In the early sessions of meetings that we have, make sure that you focus on getting input from everyone so that we have a feeling for how everyone views their roles in this process, and also focus on the vision like we've talked about in other videos. Try to figure out what are the long-term goals for the family farm as we move ahead. Also, as we've mentioned before, make sure we invite the right people, make sure the proper stakeholders are there, and if we need to have outside advisors like an attorney or a tax professional or accountant or a human resource consultant or even a family communications consultant, make sure they're on hand as well to answer some questions or to facilitate the conversation as we might need them to. In some later meetings, it may be important to have some critical vendors such as our banker there, because the feasibility of our plans going forward might require some professional input from those vendors, and so it might be beneficial to have them there as well. As we have these family meetings, make sure that you set ground rules, have clearly agreed to rules for everyone so that you understand how decisions are going to be made. Confidentiality may also be important, so you might want to have provisions about how you're going to keep any disagreements within the group and not share those outside of the group. Keep minutes of your meeting, because you might want to go back as you go later on into your decision process and wonder, now, what did we say at our first family meeting about this value? Or what did we say about our role with respect to this plan? Having those records is going to be very, very important. And then, of course, as you end each meeting, make sure that you have organization in place for the next meeting. Make sure that as you leave each meeting, you know when the next meeting is going to occur, who needs to be there, and also make sure that every meeting concludes with everyone having clear expectations about what they're going to do between this meeting and the next meeting. This is so critical for making sure this process goes forward. Without this step, you're going to find that you may have a really productive meeting and then nothing ever comes out of it. Remember, these meetings aren't going to serve a lot of value unless we actually get clear action steps out of them. For something as important as a family transition plan, one thing you might want to look at is a family retreat. In other words, you might look at actually having a specific long-term meeting, so to speak, where you're going to really get in depth about some of the issues to be discussed. And so that may mean a weekend or some other period of time where you're all away from the business at some, again, physically comfortable, neutral site where you can really roll up your sleeves and dig into the discussion process. Obviously, these retreats are going to be a little bit less frequent than the regular family business meetings that we've talked about. You might want to do this on a semi-annual or maybe an annual basis, but this might be a good idea as you kick off your farm transition planning process to really, again, get the depth of discussion that you want to have. At the retreat, you tend to focus on big picture issues. This is the type of meeting that's well suited to having a large number of stakeholders, and the prolonged period of time that you've got opens you up a little bit to engage in some of those in-depth discussions. These may be talks that take a few hours or maybe even a couple of days. Since we're talking about some pretty high impact decisions here, you might want to ask an advisor, a family communications expert, or a mediator, or someone, again, who's got a lot of experience at facilitating difficult discussions to guide that discussion, and that might be really important for this to be as low stress an event for your family as well. And since this is a stressful event, make sure you incorporate fun for your family. Have the event at a lodge or a resort so that you can spend some time and some deep discussion and then decompress. Spend some fun time with your family and remind yourselves, hey, we actually like these people. We enjoy spending time with each other, and that can actually help you a lot in dealing with some of the emotional stress that the transition discussion process can actually cause. Lots of people sometimes don't understand the value of regular meetings, but we can tell you from experience that there is a lot of value there. Just the process of organizing and effectively conducting the meetings can really help build leadership skills, not just in the current leaders of your business, but in the future leaders of your family business as well. Don't be afraid to engage younger members of the family in these discussions and give them some leadership roles. Maybe they take minutes. Maybe they serve as a conversation facilitator. Maybe they're responsible for sending out agendas, but build in them those leadership skills that you want to see in future managers, because that's going to be very important as you plan for the future ownership and management of your business. As you may recall from one of the earlier videos that we have in the series, one of the 3 reasons that farm transitions so often fail is because we failed to prepare that next generation of leadership. But by engaging that next generation in these kinds of discussions, we help prepare them for the role that they're about to take on. We increase family participation, and people that feel like they've had a spot at the table, that feel like they've had a chance to be heard, are much less likely to cause problems for the transition process as we go down the road. You know, those feelings of alienation or isolation or being frozen out are often what's the source of resentment that leads people to challenge the transition plan in the future. But giving everyone a chance to give their input and feel like they've been heard can be tremendously beneficial. It just builds a stronger farm business. I mean, if you look at all of the great companies, they've got great channels of communication that remain open and that constantly seek input from stakeholders. We want to be like that. We want to have a family business that has that robust communication and that builds a strong farm business. In turn, that enables our business to preserve the values, traditions, and history of our family, and that's really what we're all about. If you ask farmers why they want to pass on their farms, lots of times they say, well, because I got so much out of the values that the farm instilled in me. That's what we're trying to do here, preserve values, traditions, and history. And this process can go a long way towards that. At the same time, it can also help us recognize and resolve conflict. Because what's probably more important to us than keeping the farm together is keeping the family together. And if we can have good communication, that can really help us to keep the family together. You've probably taken in a lot through this short presentation. Where can you go for more information? Well, there are a number of books that we used when we were developing the transition workbook, and we think you'll find them of value as well. One of those is the book Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. When we're talking about the future of the family farm, the stakes are pretty high. And so this book is a great resource for you to review, whether you're talking about your family farm business or you're just talking about communications with important people in your life in general. Crucial Conversations is a great resource, as is Family Meetings, How to Build a Stronger Family and a Stronger Business. This book is targeted specifically at how you conduct family business meetings for family-owned businesses. That's a great way for us to develop, like we said, stronger businesses and stronger families as well. And then if you've got some curiosity about some of those generational traits that we talked about, When Generations Collide is another great example there. That can help you learn a little bit more about traditionals, about Gen Xers, Boomers, and Millennials, and really understanding the perspectives that they bring to any sort of business, whether it be a family business or otherwise. So just to recap, today we've talked about improving personal communication skills as a means of helping improve the success chances that we have with our farm transition plan. We talked about how to understand others' perspectives and how to engage them more in those family business meetings. And we've talked about how those family business meetings can actually strengthen both the farm and the business. And again, at the end of the day, I think that's what we're really trying to accomplish with our farm transition process. Just a reminder, anytime you want to learn more about any of these topics, you can refer to the Farm Transitions Workbook and all of the supporting resources that we've placed at the Farm Transitions website. That's agecon.okstate.edu/farm transitions. Thank you for watching this video, and we hope you enjoy the farm transition materials that are available for you on the website.